Greetings, everybody. This is your humble host, Krish Dunham, coming to you again after a long hiatus. This particular session or message is actually going to be a little longer, and it is titled Mentoring Values and Influence. Actually, it's an amalgamation of a talk that was done most recently in the city of Chicago for a group of educators. Some of them asked if the conversation was recorded, and we said no, and they asked if I could do something in an abridged version to get them the gist of what we engaged in that day. So mentoring values and influence is actually a process that has about 7 distinct elements to it. It is designed as part of the growth process of you as an individual who may be seeking a mentor. But more importantly, if you are in a position of influence and can raise up the next generation of leaders, here are some of the principles you can follow. The humor and the other attributes that we used as part of the live discussion may be relegated to the backboard, and we get into the nitty-gritty of it pretty quick. But as a preamble, what I want to do is I want to introduce the culmination of the talk at the start, because one of the questions asked at the end of that presentation on mentoring values and influence dealt with the broader parameters of culture and the collapse of the moral abilities that we as an individual species have as a part of our ingrained conscience. Now, the confluence of where we arrived with the educators today are people who are confronted with the stark reality of whether the kids in front of them are viewing the world in a Mad Max kind of dystopian, destructive, despair-filled future, or are they looking at it in a Star Wars realm where it is glitzy and glamorous and technology is bright and allowing us to explore new frontiers, create avatars through virtual reality, and challenge our mind to go to destinations that the physical body may never be able to do. When I made that particular statement, the people looked at me and suddenly realized that where we are in positions of influence is far away from where we ourselves were influenced. The concept of good and bad is blurred. The concept of right and wrong is blurred. The lines between hope and effectiveness are blurred because everything is put on you as kind of a big burden on your shoulder that if somehow you have achieved and you have climbed on someone else's back. While history is replete with examples of people who may have just done that, a vast majority of people do succeed because it is the right thing to do. It is part of human dignity. So the illustration I gave them as where we are as a society was actually based on 2 books that are broadly offered in social construct today. Being educators, I tried to give them the anthropology of my own evidence for the stance I have taken and the places I have arrived at. The 2 books in question are, of course, George Orwell's seminal work, 1984, written in 1948, and Aldous Huxley's work, A Brave New World, written about 10, 12 years earlier than Orwell's work. Now, Brave New World predicted a dystopian future where he talked about stability and community and identity, and he goes off into this paradigm of trying to create a future that had no joy in it as the luster was taken away because of the automatons we would become as technology and biology and genealogy were all constructed in a lab. He goes on in that book to reveal the fact that we need to take joy out of people's desire to explore and expand their horizons and just basic things like loving the countryside out of them, but still have enough engineering built into the scientific experiments of creating these babies in a lab that would allow them to still want country sports and rely on the infrastructure of a government that would get them to those places. So transportation and electricity and food and shelter would all have to be provided in this dystopian view of Huxley's world, where the community and the stability and the identity would be controlled by the state, but we would be numb to the point where we would not want to do anything invigorating for ourselves because we would be entertained to be these automatons completely happy with the system created. Now that's Huxley's world. Orwell predicted a very different world with a ministry of truth, which is considering interesting because America has just said that we're going to have a ministry of disinformation or something like that. But Orwell's words were even more chilling when he said the dystopia that he predicted in 1984, written in 1948, was very different. He predicted a world where people would be in totalitarian regimes, where we would be told what to read and how to ingest what we read and how to interpret what was ingested. His three moods were: war will be peace, freedom will be slavery, and ignorance will be strength. Now, the reason I have these memorized to rote is because we are running this dangerous parallel right now. When we try to influence people and mentor them, we have to figure out which side of the equation they feel actually validates their core belief. Now, when you lay this out to educators, their minds begin to run because these are very qualified people intellectually. Academically, they are very gifted. But they are structured by rules and regulations to say that the parent has now dropped off his child. One group of people believe that the children that come into these academic environments that are funded by the state have to be corralled and have to be cajoled in such a way that they would come out as those robots. Now, Huxley's prediction was people would be too entertained to read, and Orwell's prediction was people would be told what to read. Now, fast forward to the year 1984, that both of these had somehow injected into their own vernacular. Huxley had a broader time frame. But in 1985, a book was written called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. Now, the reason for this backdrop is Postman said, we have now arrived at 1984 and we have seen it go by. Was Huxley true or was Orwell true? And he actually landed on the side of Huxley, saying because of the way our media works, because of the way our entertainment industry works, because of the way our politics works, because of the way our journalism works, almost everything is entertainment. In fact, Postman in his book said, can you imagine watching the evening news and seeing something as horrific as the Chernobyl disaster in Russia, and how what man decided to create now created this vast wasteland? And then they say, we're going to go to a break where we'll listen from our sponsors. And on the other side of the break, they talk about something else. So the way Postman presented his information was between two diametrically opposite, diabolical situations on planet Earth, you are entertained by an advertising for Cocoa Puffs. So man is now numbed. We do not understand the severity of the world we live in, and everything is packaged in its immediacy. So when I presented this to them, they were all quite curious as to how I had arrived at that. But I decided to give that at the start because that particular illustration was given to them in the Q&A. Going back to the mentoring values and influence, and obviously this particular clip is being presented for those that were in attendance that day and those that were watching. So in mentoring values and influence, the 7 precepts I presented to them was first, instruct them on principles they cannot learn on their own. Now, all 7 of these principles came to me as a hybrid from what I learned from Dr. John Maxwell. Luminary John Maxwell's 3 principles was, he said, introduce them to people they could not meet on their own, teach them things they could not learn on their own, and take them to places they could not go on their own. I expanded it to this list of 7 to include some sub-constructs which were part of my own life and my mentor and hero, Mr. Zig Ziglar. So the first concept of instruct them on principles they could not learn on their own was when I asked my mentor, can I do what you do? And many of you in leadership positions get asked this question by people you lead. Hey, what did it take you to do what you do so that you became the manager, or you became the supervisor, or you wrote the best-selling book, or you're now an award-winning speaker, or you're now a cinematographer, or your YouTube channel, whatever it is. People who have legend attract other people who wonder what made that legend. Now, sometimes they say it's hard work. Sometimes they say it's sheer luck. Sometimes they just don't want to deal with you. So they say I was in the right place at the right time. But my mentor was different. When I asked him, what can I do to be able to do what you now do? He says, give me permission to challenge every assumption you have ever held dear. Now, in all my education, and I have a master's degree, and I was never given that kind of direct quantitative positioning. Give me permission to contradict or challenge every assumption you've held dear. Now, assumption is far from the quantifiable proof of what comes out in the predictability of the work you do or the profitability of how you do it. Assumption is just something that you think. My assumption as a kid born in the rural part of India was I would always struggle all of my life because I came from the wrong side of the tracks. So my father was a worker and my friends' families inherited. So I had all the isms and schisms. And the isms and schisms was I was not born into royalty. My family is not third generation educated from Harvard. I don't have a large foundation. We don't have a lot of lands. My father studied under a streetlight. My mother was a child bride. What chance did I have? These are assumptions that begin to manifest and eat away at the prime motivations that define us, the prime motivations that dictate and eventually develop and will subsequently deliver us. So when he says, give me permission to challenge every assumption you've ever held dear, a light bulb went off because for the first time someone was saying, every time you think of why you can't do something, come to me and we'll figure out the why. The how is easy. How you can't do something is just go with the flow. So that was the first principle I gave them. And this was a challenging principle to educators as such, because when educators educate, imagine asking that question. What are the assumptions you have about your own success? What are the assumptions you have about your own progress? Do you believe capitalism is good? Do you believe communism is evil? Do you believe capitalism is evil? Do you believe socialism is the answer? Now, these are now nice, but if you use that Huxleyan model and someone says, hey, you know what? We need to distribute the goods and services so the people at the means of production should benefit from the output of its profitability. Sounds like a Lenin manifesto that was really good to take on the czars of Russia. But along the heels of Lenin comes Stalin a short while later, and a little power is good, a lot of power must be absolutely good. And that nightmare lasted 75 years. Yeah, it was right in the initial phases when they got rid of the czars that were looting people and said, let us give back to the people some amount of the production. But if your assumption is that, hey, the desire to get away from what we are is completely throughout the system, we have to go back and question another assumption that G.K. Chesterton posited when he says, before you throw down a boundary, have you even done basic investigation to ask yourself why it was up there in the first place? It's easy to find fault. Mr. Ziegler often said most people find fault like there's a reward for it, and there is no reward. The second principle was introduce people to pioneers they could not meet on their own. I'll never forget the day I was in India with Mr. Ziegler in 2005. The land of my birth had now been the home where my hero was doing a couple of his talks. The man who had liberated my mindset was speaking to about 300 executives. And when he finished speaking, he kind of realized that I had only been given a short time on the program of a day and he carried the load. He wondered why they were so eager to learn from him, but not as eager to learn from me, even though most of the information I teach, I learned from him. And I have modified it, I have morphed it, I've created the language, I've culturally translated. I'm more adept in making the examples of Mr. Ziegler's seminal work fit around the world because I've traveled to more places. He knew that, even though I was younger. But there are assumptions built within the Indian hierarchy that who is this kid who is a short while removed from having left this country because he couldn't make it here, coming back, standing in front of me, and I built a multi-million-dollar enterprise, talking to me. I'd rather listen to the white wizard. Assumption, assumption, assumption. Now, Mr. Ziegler brought me in front of the audience and he said, now these are pioneers I would not meet on their own because they would not give me the time of day. They were executives. They were the creme de la creme. They were the cream of the crop. They were the height of the barrel. Mr. Ziegler brings me on at the end of the day and puts his arm around me, which these people gasp because that's not something you do. The caste system would prevent you from doing it from about 300 million people, but the class system would prevent you from putting your arm around someone who's just a lowly worker, which at that time I was. I was just a telemarketer traveling with him. I had no official capacity. Maybe I was director of international operations, big whoop. But when he put his arm around me, he said something to the audience that made them actually have to stand on their feet because that was his command. He says, "People of India, you sent me a boy who was scared. I bring you back a man who is my legacy. Applaud your native son. It is because of the depth and the love of which he spoke for his roots that allowed me to make this trip. I am not here to impress you. I am here to fulfill the goal that one of the people I trained had." And suddenly the onus was taken off his own ability for having now come to another country and put it on a child. Just this morning I was on another call and someone said, "How was it to walk in the shadow of a man in this world of speed, ease, and convenience? In this world of give it to me today? How was it to walk in his shadow for 10 years? I said, "You used the right word, shadow." Basic physics tells us that when the shadow is there, that means the light is falling on an object. And if you're in the shadow, that means you're right behind the object. If the object moves, the light will fall on you. Simple optics worked. The third principle is include. Make them believe. Include them in things. Make them believe in things they would not believe on their own. Include them in projects. Include them in activities. Now, one of the principles I like to share in this is nothing too big that is beyond you, nothing too small that is beneath you. I remember one day I thought I would do something different. I went and knocked on the door of Mr. Ziegler's hotel, somewhere in Iowa, early in my career, maybe early 90s. And I said, "Can I have your shoes?" He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I saw a shoe shine guy down the street." Now remember, the principle that I'm participating in, I had to do for someone else. Emerson said, "If you're going to pull me up, you better be on higher ground." So wherever you are in this journey, if you're looking for someone to pull you up, you better be pulling other people up so that when you leave, they can fill your space, because otherwise that void is left. So I saw a shoe shine guy who was wrapping up his shoe shine stall, or the little chair he had and the box he had in the hotel lobby, at about 9 o'clock. I said, "Hey, if you give me 15 minutes, I'm going to run up and get you 2 pairs of shoes, and I'll give you $5, which was his amount. And I said, "I'll give you another $5 tip. So you have $15 in the waiting if you just give me 10 minutes to go up and get the 2 pairs of shoes." He had nothing to lose, everything to gain. He says, "I'll wait." I ran up to my room and I got my pair of shoes, and then I went to knock on Mr. Ziegler's door and said, "Give me your shoes." He said, "Why?" I said, "Sir, I remember you telling me once that when your shoes are shined and your trousers are creased and your shirt is pressed and you join the smile, compliment, and handshake club, you put a little pep in your step and a little bounce to your ounce." Most of his words. He said, "I did. I remember saying that." I said, "Sir, I couldn't help but notice that your shoes are a little scuffed. And if I shine your shoes, you'll do better. You'll feel better. If you feel better tomorrow morning, you'll speak better. If you speak better, you'll be more energized. If you're more energized, more people will come to the product center at the back of the room where I am selling books and tapes. In short, if you do better, I'll sell more product and make more commission." He said, "You made all that connection to scuffed shoes?" I said, "Well, I had to make up something. I just thought I'd get it done." Couple of months later, he says, "I want you to relieve this boy of his other responsibilities in the company and let him travel with me full time. I've got major plans for him." But when they asked him why, he says, "There's no job I can give him that is so small, he will say, 'This is beneath me.' Yet there's no job that is so big, he'll say, 'This is beyond me.' He will approach both of those things with equal fervor. If he comes up short, he'll ask for help. If he goes beyond, he'll give credit. I think this boy gets it." Now, I don't know if I got it or not, and I don't know if I was just hurting to the degree where I thought to myself, "Man, let me just take a shot. I've got nothing to lose." The principle is still the same. The way I teach it today is, if you try something you've never tried before, and you fall flat on your face, you break even. The next principle is involve them. Involve them intellectually, Involve them in things that they would not begin to involve themselves on their own. Now, I use intellectual here because one of the illustrations I like best comes from Bob Townsend. Bob Townsend, of course, wrote Up the Down organization and has been credited with being the person who revolutionized the way the Avis rent-a-car company was turned around and eventually made a people company and all of those things. Townsend said, and I think I basically may have borrowed it and paraphrased it in some way, but he says that every meeting he ever had, every group he ever tried to impact, every individual he ever tried to influence, there were only three basic questions. What do you do? What would you like to do? And how will you know when you get there? Think about the simplicity of that, but you have to basically involve people in this intellectual exercise. Very often we don't ask people what you do because when you do, you know the answer. I don't know whether I'm coming or going. I'm so busy. There's so much month left after the pay and all of these things. What they are saying is, I, in my mind, have interpreted that activity means accomplishment. Edmund Hillary never once in a million years, when he found himself on top of Mount Everest in March of 1953, would have said, hey, I wonder how I got up here. He had to plan, he had to prepare, and he had to expect, and there were pitfalls around the way. So what do? Are you a mountaineer? Are you an adventurer? When people ask me what I do, I say, well, whatever it is, it's got to be illegal. I'm having too much fun. And they kind of tongue-in-cheek look at me and say, well, tell me a little more. That little elevator pitch bought me the 2 minutes I need to explain my narrative. I said, well, for 6 months of the year, I have the privilege of working with the folks who own and afford yachts, and they pay me well. So the other half of the year, I can go and teach the people who work on boats, and I don't ask them to pay me. In short, my life is evenly divided between the yacht people and the boat people. Whatever it is, what do? You have to be able to articulate that. This is role identity. Trying to be something you're not. Anytime you go to California and you meet someone and you say, what do you do? Well, I'm a waitress on my way to being an actress. Why don't you just say, I'm an actress, just learning how to do waitressing in case that doesn't work out or in case I have to do it simultaneously. I mean, companies like Marriott and all would ask their people to do a day in the life off, which means one day you have to just get up out of your role and do the role of someone else within the establishment. So you understand hospitality from the inside out. What do? Role identity. The second question is much more important in terms of vision casting. What would you like to do? This is role destiny. Many of us want to go. Henry David Thoreau said, all of us want to build castles in the air. None of us want to build a foundation on the ground. Many of us have bucket lists. Many of us have the things we need to do. On Monday, God willing, if the weather permits and the airlines are on schedule, I'll begin my journey towards South Africa. And there, when I land a couple of days later, will be country number 76. When I was telling my host in South Africa today that that'll be country number 76, he says, oh, that's A+, which means A is 75 within some of the British education systems of old, including India. I don't think I ever got a grade of 76 on anything in my life. So yeah, this would be a good grade. But I thought to myself, I've always had that dream. In fact, when I end this presentation, I'm going to give credit to a lady who allowed me to have some of those dreams. The ways in which they educated us to go have a vision that was beyond. Where do you want to go in this journey? Mentors need to be able to influence the people that they are mentoring by painting that vision. By painting the vision of, hey, I will go with you as far as I can go, but then where you go beyond me will be. It's just like a father teaching his kid how to ride a bike. The first couple of times you do it, they fall, you pick them up, but they are confident that every time they get up and try that balance, you're right behind them. But there will come that time when the pedaling starts, the momentum begins, and then you just push them, and they're still confident you're there, and now they have gone a merry mile, and when they look over their shoulder, they realize that all they need is their own effort with a steady stream. And that's what goals are. John F. Kennedy said, goals are nothing more than dreams with feet. And mentors have to constantly infuse the concept of where do you want to go? But using Bob Townsend's three, what do you do? Role identity. What would you like to do? Role destiny. There is a benchmark qualifier which is very quantitative to the earlier two qualitative, and that is, how will you know when you get there? How will you know when you get there? When I ask people these questions and they tell me all the pie in the sky, What do you do? Well, I'm doing this. What would you like to do? I'd like to do the great American novel. How will you know when I get there? I don't know. Those are wishful thinking, and some of the goals have to be out of sight, not out of mind. Those are long-range goals, take beyond 5 years, whatever it is. But the benchmarking is very important when you have some of these bucket lists, and one of my friends did that very well. He was running a very successful company, and he realized that he was getting to the point where bigger organizations were going to approach him, and the amount of millions they were going to put in front of him for an organization he built would be too hard to refuse, because retirement sounded like a good thing after 30 years of work. But as he created his bucket list, it was very simple. He said, I want to go to all 7 continents. I want to be able to visit the Great Wall, see some of the wonders of the world. But he articulated, and there were about 30 things he put on there. And each one of them had a dollar amount, I guess. So he basically said that when I sell my company, I'm going to allocate a percentage of those resources towards my bucket list. The rest would be more than enough for me and my family to invest and live happy. I had the privilege of traveling with him to India when the Taj Mahal was on his bucket list. And some of the things we did along the way were beginning to understand that this benchmark is vital to human achievement. But the mentors have to do that for you. Mentors have to instill in you this desire to know who you are, to know what you're doing, to know what you want to do, and to know how you're going to be able to quantify it and evaluate it when you get there. Next is invite them to places and things they would not conjure up on their own. I gave the principle here of book writing, something I've had the privilege of participating in 6 or 7 now, depending on whether you count whether my name's on the front or not. And the goal was 10 when I began this journey. So again, I'm closer to the end. And I think the next book that I've contributed to will be book number 8, where I've collaborated. And there are 2 more in the works where someone has asked me to produce a significant amount. So we'll hit that number. But the interesting thing, it all began one day when I got an envelope with sounded very official from a publisher, and I had not written anything. But the publisher, when I opened it up, had a letter in it saying, hey, we have just received the manuscript for Mr. Ziegler's next book, Over the Top, and we would like your permission to use your story as it is presented here in the chapter or the subsect marked The Immigrant's Attitude. Now, Mr. Ziegler was talking a lot about the immigrant's attitude at that time, and occasionally he would mention me as an immigrant who came here with $9, whatever it is. But to now see an official letter from a publisher with my name saying we want to use your story. Now, this goes back to that inviting them to activities. Think about it. I'd always thought that writing a book would be a fun thing. I have an uncle who wrote a bunch of books and was a bestseller in the physics realm in India. And I always thought, man, it would be good to be one of the other members of the family to eventually get to write a book. But when this official letter comes and you go up and say, Mr. Ziegler, it's okay, you can always use my story. He says, no, but I need your permission for it to make sure that it's accurate, that you approve of its accuracy, and you're okay with it. Now, I'm a telemarketer selling the same books. Can you imagine the joy that goes through me when someone says, hey, I'd like to order a case of the new books that Mr. Ziegler just came out with for my sales team. And, you try to edge the conversation into, yeah, and I hope you get to page 87. And they say, what's on page 87? I said, that's my story. And then they call back and say, wow, that's really cool that Mr. Ziegler wrote about you. Eventually, he spoke about me. Eventually, he added me to his audio programs, and he wrote articles. I actually made one of his newspaper articles, but that may be for a different story. But that begins the journey of realizing that when you see your name in print, it goes back to what Dr. John Maxwell said. Maxwell said that when you tell someone a story, it tells them you care. When you tell them a story that matters to them, it tells them you care about them. But when you tell their story to others, now they realize that they have a legitimate reason to be in the forefront, to be an author and no longer just a reader. The last 2 and then we'll be done. Impart hope. This is part of Future Skill Attitude. Here during the course of that conversation, I gave the illustration of Jaime Escalante. The movie Stand and Deliver that had Edward James Olmos in it is a movie that talked about the barrio in Los Angeles and basically Jaime Escalante's work with kids in the calculus exam and how there was consternation when all of them got good grades and people thought they had cheated and he made a bunch of them take them again and all that. It's a beautiful movie. It's a real story that came to life. But within the confines of that story, a subset story was told, and I may miss the narrative a little bit, but it's a story of two kids with the same name. One of them was a kind of underachiever, one of them was an overachiever. And one day, one of the kids with that name came to the school saying she wanted to meet Mr. Escalante. And in his mind, he had the perception that, what the heck, I mean, I don't think the kid who's underperforming's mother would want to come and talk to me about anything. They're probably shirking it anyway. It's probably the achiever's mom. So when the mother said, how's my kid doing? Thinking he was talking to the mother of the achiever, he gave that illustration by saying that, oh, he's superb, he's amazing to work with, he's an attentive kid, he sets the standard, whatever teachers brag on. When the mother went home, the kid said, I heard you were with my teacher today. He says, yeah, what did he say? Expecting a bad report. The mother said, no, he said, you're pretty good. Now the image changes in the mind of the boy who says, if my teacher believes that about me, I may not be a superstar, but I definitely don't need to be where I am. See, perception is crossing that threshold to become a version of what others believe about you. And the other kid started accelerating a little bit. He didn't go to straight A, but at least he got up from failing grades to C. Now, you've heard these placebo stories about two people given the same amount of data, and one people are a monitored group actually given the actual thing, and others are just a placebo. And you kind of see the results, and many of those time and motion studies have been done. But the concept is really true. If someone brags on you in your absence, something amazing will happen when you actually are in the presence of the people where you have been bragged about. People will say, hey, you know what? It's good to finally meet you. People talk very highly of you. That's a better way to navigate through this world. And as a result of that, impart hope in people. Again, the definition I've oft used on my YouTube channel is the definition that comes from the aforementioned Huxley, who said, he says, it was not Huxley, I think it was someone else who said, hope is the foundational quality of all change. And I think Maxwell said, if there's hope in the future, there's power in the present. Adler said, hope is the foundational quality of all change. So impart that hope. And lastly, instill them in a desire. One of my teachers was my English teacher in school, Mrs. Simon, and I've talked about her on other broadcasts before, and I'm now closely again trying to reconnect with the family. But she had I don't know if it was a soft spot. I don't even know if she realized it. It may have just been her nature. English was a subject I consistently got better grades than other people, and it's probably stood its test because I make a living communicating globally today, and the vernacular I use, the language I use, the vocabulary I use, all comes from the language of English. Now, I speak two other Indian languages. I can actually preach or give a complete sermon in the language of Hindi, and I can converse in Telugu. But when I'm called to communicate, I use English. And this English began with that desire of people saying that, not everybody, within the confines of the Indian education system, English was a necessity. Hindi is a necessity. Sanskrit is a necessity. You have to be trilingual till the 7th grade and at least bilingual through college. It's part of the system. They're just languages that are added. They're not adding the language for you to be a global denizen or some kind of a communicator who would understand anthropology of civilizations. What they harp on is the mathematics and the chemistry and the physics and the biology and the science, which is ironic today because in the world we live in, especially in the West, those are the things nobody wants to teach anymore. There are actually entire states in the US who have passed legislation saying we should not worry about passing grades in some of these subjects because it marginalizes those who cannot compete. I don't know what the answer is, but all I do realize is that you have to put that hope and you have to give them desire. The desire in me was to go play games about different places that the ships in the harbor would go. Then go back to the encyclopedia, and when I teach this component, people kind of laugh. I said, you had to go to a library, and the library I had to tell them was like this big building, and it had books, and then you could go and you had to have a card, and when you gave that card, it was a physical card, and they can't understand the concept. Why would I do all of that when on Kindle or Google or any of those libraries, I've got 600 million titles on my phone? Question is, it's a smart device. Are you smart enough to use what the smart device is? That answer may be, again, a different dialogue. But I tell them that we had to go to the library and look at the atlas and find the name of a country that we thought the ship would be going to. At that time, I probably knew the names of about 6 or 7 or maybe 15 countries because of the geography that we were taught. There's a globe in the classroom, whatever those things are. There's a map of the world. I mean, to think that there are 53 countries just in Africa. I mean, these things were mind-blowing to a child of 8 or 9 living in India. So I remember going to the library and reading those stories about these countries. Then Mrs. Simon recommended that not only should we do that, we need to go back and look at the encyclopedia again and find that country and a little bit about its history. This led to me studying in a different way with a different motivator, my dad, asking me to study American history while I was still in India. When I landed in America in 1986, like any other immigrant, I was a hard luck case. I had very little money. They don't give you a lot of your money in exchange. My wife had found out she'd been laid off for her job when she came to India to get married to me. So we began on that unemployment insurance. But there's hope around. When I landed, I very quickly realized I knew more about this country than majority of the people knew about it, having been born here. I knew its history. I knew some of its founding fathers. I went back and began to study. And as soon as I landed here, I started to immerse myself. Now it's going on 20 years. I go to Austin, Texas every summer and teach young kids there American history. Not that they couldn't learn it anywhere else, but they kind of get to learn it from the lens of an immigrant who studied it not because he had to, studied it not because he was forced to, studied it because he wanted to. When you look at mentoring, there are 2 things that take place. One is the nice to have. One is the must have. The third component of is it a luxury will manifest itself, but those 2 things create a very unique divide. So when again, wrapping it up and going back to my educator friends, who I hope this will bless you because this is a gist of the conversation we had. I hope you will bring your questions to me so we can answer them in a roundabout way. But going back to what we said that day, and what we said that day was, when we get to Checkpoint Charlie, which is the end of our journey, there are only 2 statements we can make. I wish I had, or I'm glad I did. I'm glad I did is one of purpose. I wish I had is one of regret. Now, one of the things that we also talked about was this toxic barometers that we have, the lines that are drawn in the sand, where regardless of which side of the political aisle you are, you probably have some hyperbole that is built up in you that is something that you're not going to get rid of. When you go back to those assumptions, there are certain assumptions we have that we actually believe to be real. And in believing those assumptions to be real, we will never give them up. I ended with this. I said tradition is just tradition. It has never been a strategy. Culture is just culture. It's never going to be a formula. That's why we have 8+ billion people on planet Earth. That's why God in his infinite wisdom made only one you. Now, these are hard things to say within the confines of academia because, again, do you believe you were created or do you believe you're a grown-up germ? I'm not picking sides. I told them I was an evangelical Christian and they knew that. They didn't have to go very far. You just go on YouTube and you'll find that out. It's not a question of what I subscribe to. My self-image and the mentoring I received does allow me to validate and logically defend just about everything I believe. In the sense that if you asked me questions about created order, if you asked me questions about anything. And lastly, I told them, I said, it's not just that I am someone who comes from a religious bent that I should be marginalized and not allowed to speak in culture. I said, let me give you an illustration. And this was the illustration I left them with. I said, I'm just going to stay within the realm of science, within the concept of 2 people. And I want you to ask yourself, why is it that when we look at mentoring and influence, that the words character and honesty and integrity and love and loyalty and faith and family are immediately jettisoned because we believe that it doesn't follow the science? We want to acquiesce to the feelings and not to the facts. And everything I mentioned above is called, they call faith a fact of fancy. Just words. Well, the illustration I gave them was this. I said 2 different people, great scientific minds, both had enormous impact in the scientific community. One was Sir Isaac Newton in the 1600s, held the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics at Cambridge, a physicist who held a mathematics chair, 30 years. Fast forward to the 1900s, Stephen Hawking held the same chair for 33 years. Again, another physicist who held the mathematics chair. Two different people. One wrote the theory of everything, a slice of life, or whatever it is, the time and whatever his book was. And Newton's work, of course, the celebrated work was Principia Mathematica, which was used by scientists for 300 years. Newton comes out with this gravity and he explains it in three different ways. Newton, of course, was a believer. Newton says that I can explain what gravity is as a mechanism. I can show how gravity works as a method. And his formula for that have allowed people to land on the moon. But he says, I cannot explain the agency of gravity as to why it exists. He ascribed that to something supernatural. He left it to God. Fast forward, Stephen Hawking just comes up with a statement and says, because gravity exists, we can believe mankind does not need a creator. Interesting. Two people from the same community holding the same chair at the same school for 30 plus years in the same discipline come to diametrically opposite assumptions on the same theory of gravity. Now, you and I know you go to a building, you don't challenge the theory of gravity because if you step off the ledge, you'll fall. That's why it's called the law of gravity. Anything else that's not a law is either called a theory or a hypothesis. Now, I ask the educators this question. Why do I, as a motivational speaker and an anthropological communicator, have to defend my beliefs as some kind of an archaic transcript, as an archaic offering that was relegated because of postmodernism and is archaic in this world of post-truth? And when I left them with that, suddenly, the intrigue began and the Q&A began. So I'm going to leave that with you. The principles are mentoring, influence, and all of the things that go therein. Ask yourself, if the 7 principles matter to you and you want the 7 principles as a one-page PDF that you can refresh and reaffirm for yourself, please just send us an email to the information that will be given at the end of this video. The website is skylifesuccess.com, but info@skylifesuccess.com, PDF on mentoring, and we'll see you down the road.